Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, January Windows updates breaking audio playback on some devices. Also, the Gen AI race heats up with Chinese AI company's DeepSeek app surpassing ChatGPT in the Apple App Store. And an exploit has been published for a high-severity configuration manager vulnerability. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which, of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And also brought to you by Master Packager, who make an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. The first story has to be about DeepSeek. The Chinese AI company has been all over the mainstream media for a few days at this point, so I apologize if this seems like me beating a dead horse, because I'm sure you've heard all about it in the last few days. But for those who have not, a few days ago there were reports that DeepSeek launched their new Gen AI app that uses their open source DeepSeek v3 model, which most media outlets claim was developed for less than $6 million. And the claim is the performance is on par with OpenAI's o1 model, even beating it in some benchmark testing. I think it is worth qualifying that I don't think DeepSeek themselves have claimed that it only cost $6 million to develop their solution. This was just the cost of this specific model's training, excluding costs associated with prior research and experiments on architectures, algorithms, data, and more. So DeepSeek were actually pretty forthcoming in saying that it was just the training that cost $6 million, but a lot in the media started just to repeat and say, it only cost them $6 million. This is crazy. How come it's cost these other companies so much more money? When really, it's actually misinformation. DeepSeek v3 data model is reportedly much more efficient than other AI services, which I think is the big takeaway from this. And there are suggestions that the service utilizes very large models to help smaller models get smart at things that you wanted to get smart at, which makes it more cost efficient. So for example, I guess if you're using the service for coding or something like that, and you basically have a narrow scope of what you want the model to be good at, it's able to glean that specific information off a larger language model and then just have that available to you, so your queries are not going across such a broad spectrum, I guess. Therefore, it requires a lot less resources for those queries. This is certainly an interesting development, as the US government brought in the CHIP Act as a means to cut off Chinese developers from getting the hardware required for effectively building large language models, again, because those are resource intensive models and those broad queries eat up CPU like crazy. So, those sweet GPUs and NPUs that are required were essentially cut off from those Chinese developers. But in turn, to compete and develop their own, because they didn't have access to that hardware, just out of necessity, they had to build something that was more efficient. Now, the extra wrinkle is that the US government just established an AI initiative with a plan to invest $500 billion. But that looks a little bit silly now, given DeepSeek's claims that they built theirs for much less. Well, really, that's not the claim, but that is the claim that's being repeated by the media. So that has then caused a bit of a pile-on saying, whoa, why is someone like OpenAI, Microsoft, and all these large companies investing so much money? And why is US taxpayer money funding $500 billion when this Chinese company seemingly is spending much less? And I doubt sincerely that they are spending as much as an OpenAI. I do believe that even though that $6 million is only for the training of this specific model, I bet you they are spending a hell of a lot less to achieve this. As a result, the US stock markets took a hit, and Nvidia alone contracted by 12% when markets reopened this week. And it was reportedly the single largest loss in a single day of trading. Now, for their part, OpenAI has become quite defensive, and they are putting out claims that DeepSeek is actually gleaning a lot of their data for their data set off of OpenAI's data set, which the reaction is kind of funny because a lot of people, and not just people outside of the US, people in the US that are even in the tech space are like, oh, well, that's too bad for OpenAI. You mean the company that has been taking people's information wholesale is now complaining because someone else took that data and information from them? Well, too bad, so sad. But at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, obviously Microsoft partnering pretty closely with OpenAI, stated, quote, to see the DeepSeek new model, it's super impressive in terms of both how they have really effectively done an open source model that does this inference time compute and is super compute efficient. We should take the developments out of China very, very seriously, end quote. And that's another aspect. So the efficiency is probably the headline grabber for me, not so much the cost of what it took to build, because that's a little bit of misinformation. But the efficiency is a big topic, but also the fact that they've made it open source. Now, that claim is also being slightly disputed. They've made some of it open source, but then some of what they're doing is not open source. So there is a push for them to become a little more transparent and fill the gaps of what is not currently open source. But them doing that is also got to stick in the side of a company like an OpenAI or even Google and other competitors in the space, because theirs is not open source and they're trying to monetize on their entire solution and keep it to themselves, whereas DeepSeek is a little more open and at least has some of their product open source. Just as the app for DeepSeek became the most popular app in some of their respective app stores, like the Apple App Store, they ended up closing registrations or new registrations for their service, claiming that this is due to a large-scale malicious attacks on DeepSeek services, and they were just temporarily limiting registrations to ensure continued service. Personally, when I saw that, I thought they were just trying to cover themselves because maybe the service couldn't scale, or I thought it's possible maybe it's a denial of service attack because it was gaining so much attention. Someone decided to try and take it down, or hey, maybe even US state-based actors were trying to take it down. But I guess it has been reported that you can actually still register as a new customer or a new user for the product if you use Google sign-in. It's just the, I guess, native sign-up, it was cut off. So I guess it's not really a scale issue. It's likely that denial of service. The app and service has also received an awful lot of flack online, with claims by researchers that they managed to jailbreak the model across a wide range of scenarios, enabling it to generate malicious outputs such as ransomware development, fabrication of sensitive content, and detailed instructions for creating toxins and explosive devices. Now, some of my hot takes on this: a lot of the criticism DeepSeek is getting now are criticisms that ChatGPT also received in its earliest days of mainstream attention. There were concerns of inputted data getting ingested into ChatGPT's data set, such as, IBM, I believe early on, moved very quickly to stop its employees from using the service because some sensitive information was shared and then it was ingested into ChatGPT's publicly accessible model. But there are also ongoing concerns about ChatGPT censoring some of its outputs to protect their own interests and some interests of the US government as well. And that's something that's also being laid at the feet of DeepSeek. I guess if you ask it about the tank man from Tiananmen Square, it gets very hush-hush on the topic. But similarly, if you ask ChatGPT about some recent developments in the US government, it seems to be less forthcoming with information than it would on other topics. And as I covered on the podcast last year, if you ask about some of the lawsuits and some of the individuals that have taken claims against OpenAI, it refuses to answer on that. There were also some concerns about people using ChatGPT to write malicious code in the past by just telling it they wanted it to do it just for research purposes, and then it would just provide the code. So that's also something that's not really unique to DeepSeek, in my opinion. But these negatives seem to be getting amplified in the media and weaponized because the developers are Chinese. I feel like this is a little bit like TikTok raising the ire of some, while US social media companies and platforms like Meta, for example, are probably just as invasive and dangerous. It's just, I guess, what camp you happen to be aligned with. It would be interesting if geopolitics starts to play an even bigger part in what products are used in different regions. Like, for example, in Europe, we are using ChatGPT. I know in Italy very early on, they were moving to cut off the use of the service, but it seemed like um, European countries and European companies kind of fell in behind using these US solutions like Copilot, like ChatGPT, like Gemini. But in the future, will geopolitics dictate that, hey, maybe European companies, European governments do not use those solutions and they prefer a European created service instead? And then what would the impact of that be? Like, will that harm development and innovation of those kind of US or Western based solutions because not all of the West is leveraging those solutions? It could. It should be interesting to see how all this plays out in the next few years, though. If nothing else, it will be entertaining. And kind of coming back to the efficiency thing, I find it really interesting because I think the Gen AI market reflects a larger issue in the tech space. There has been a trend for many years where there has been an emphasis on speed of innovation and releasing new features rather than the quality of the code and quality of the products being pushed out. And as hardware has advanced and more resources have become commonplace on enterprise and consumer devices, like no longer being restricted to 4 gigs on an enterprise desktop, and a lot of organizations even standardizing on 16 gigs of memory and pretty decent processors nowadays, well, it just seems software vendors see this and they're producing products that are not designed to be efficient. On these machines that have these more resources than ever, products are being built to consume as much as they damn well please. And that's just causing a regression, in my opinion, in terms of the employee experience. If OneDrive and Teams, for example, are chewing up and reserving a bunch of resources just for themselves, even if you throw 16 gigs of memory on a machine, the performance is still not that great because these services, these products are chewing up so much of it. And with the promise of a move to the cloud and SaaS applications on Windows, which is what the enterprise requires, in my opinion, it hasn't really shaken out the way that some had forecasted, say, 10, 15 years ago. There was a time when it was expected that most applications would become web-based and be used from the browser. So, the OS and the machine would not have to do all that much of the processing in the future, and you'd be able to just use a very simple device, use your phone, and have all these powerful applications and platforms to use. And that has kind of come true, but many vendors have reverted to still presenting their products as applications on the Windows desktops. And some of it's born out of necessity because, as we've found, those web UIs can be quite restricting. Still, the Office products, for example, used in the web, it's just not as good or as rich of an experience as using the native application on the desktop. And I think that's something that's going to be hard to overcome, and it hasn't been overcome yet. So some have turned to actually building, say, like Chromium-based applications that are running within the desktop as like a native application, or they're using some other modern frameworks. But these modern frameworks being used for building these modern apps are still consuming an obscene amount of local resources. Many still require the installation of files to accompany the main entry point of the application, or like the modern application. They're still writing to the registry. They still include Windows services and more types of those kind of traditional components to accompany that main application. So to me, like, it's beggar's belief to see how these changes and this modernization, quote unquote, has really benefited customers. These moves to modernize have not really been done in a way to look at actual efficiency and the best way to run these applications for customers. It has mostly been to the benefit of vendors and trying to tie people into subscriptions and to help their own ends. So this move by DeepSeek to kind of counter and have an open source solution from the off, and also produce something that's much more efficient than what's out there, I think is kind of welcome. I know there's going to be skepticism as to the source, but that's probably an overarching theme that vendors should be reaching for. Don't just try to drive innovation. And hey, and another form of innovation that's coming to a lot of, say, EUC products and just every pretty much enterprise application is adopting AI, which then in turn is going to make their applications require greater resources to support these new features. Anyway, this is a rant and I'm going to stop, but hey, I'd be interested to hear, your take on this subject. If you look at social media, there's a hell of a lot of hot takes out there, but yeah, I'd be interested to continue to discuss this. Apologies, I went way too long on that story. I will do heavy editing, but it's probably still going to be long. But hey, getting on to some of the other news. The January 2025 Windows security updates are reportedly breaking audio playback on some systems with external DACs, which is digital to analog converters. The known issue impacts Windows 11 24H2, Windows 10 22H2, Windows Server 2019, and Server 2016 when using DACs with USB 1 audio drivers. BleepingComputer.com reports you're more likely to experience this issue if you're using a USB 1 audio driver based DAC in your audio setup, and the issue might cause USB audio devices to stop working, preventing audio playback entirely. Resulting from the issue, the device's manager might display the error, "This device cannot start, code 10, insufficient system resources exist to complete the API." Now, while there's a few different, mitigating factors to this, from what I could see in the patch mail group, and even just in other outlets reporting on this, it seems like this is actually a pretty widespread issue, or at least relatively so. And until a fix is released, Microsoft advises those affected to connect their audio devices to the PC without using a DAC to work around the issue. PC World and other outlets have highlighted a known vulnerability in 7-Zip, CVE-2025-0411, which makes it possible for hackers to bypass the Mark of the Web security feature in Windows and remotely execute code on your PC when extracting from a malware-loaded archive file. This was actually addressed with a new release of 7-Zip version 2409 back in November. But 7-Zip does not have an auto-update feature, so if you haven't updated 7-Zip, you should do that as soon as possible. This is another case of just such a utility potentially being used in cyber attacks. So when cyber gangs infiltrate your network, if they're looking on your desktops or on whatever servers or machines you have, they could look for these utilities such as a 7-Zip or maybe a WinRAR, see that there's a vulnerable version out there, and then leverage that for their attacks. I don't believe CVE-2025-0411 has been leveraged for attacks yet, but it's best to patch anyway because this is a pretty high severity vulnerability. United Health has revealed that 190 million Americans had their personal and healthcare data stolen in the Change Healthcare ransomware attack, nearly doubling the previously disclosed figure. I covered this ransomware attack last year, but the scale that's being shared now is really something else. The ransomware attack on United Health's subsidiary, Change Healthcare, is reportedly now the largest healthcare data breach in US history. The stolen data includes patients' health insurance information, medical records, billing and payment information, and sensitive personal info like phone numbers, addresses, and in some cases even social security numbers and government ID numbers. Unfortunately, the ransom was paid in this instance, but the threat actor behind the attack stated that they did not delete the stolen data as promised, and the attacker then partnered with a new ransomware operation named Ransom Hub and began leaking some of the stolen data, demanding an additional payment for the data not to be released. Then a few days later, reportedly, according to BleepingComputer.com, the Change Healthcare entry on Ransomware Hub's data leak site mysteriously disappeared, which indicates that the United Health possibly paid a second ransom demand. This is exactly what is not suggested to do. Do not pay the ransom because they will see that you're willing to pay the ransom. And in this event, we saw exactly what happened. They just ignored it, didn't delete the data, and then tried to hit them for another ransom payment. So, yep, this is probably why countries like the UK are trying to outlaw the payment of these ransoms by some companies and entities. Google has said that if you're on a version of Chrome that is older than 4 years old, you may begin to see an error message: update Chrome to start sync, or update Chrome to keep using the Chrome data in your Google account. Chrome users who still want to use the feature Chrome Sync to keep their data synced to all devices logged in with their Google account are advised that they need to update their browser to the latest version. Now, if you're still rocking a version of Chrome that's more than 4 years old, you are crazy. Chrome gets security updates every week now. So to be 4 years behind is just, you're asking for trouble. So I'm hoping this does not affect too many people. But hey, if you somehow are on an old version, you're going to see that your bookmarks and other features that are updated are roaming with the Chrome Sync feature. They're not going to roam anymore, and you're going to get one of those errors. So, update to in your version of Chrome, please. As previously covered on the podcast, Microsoft says Windows 11 24H2 has entered the broad deployment phase and is now available to all people via Windows Update. The latest Windows version has also begun rolling out to all eligible PCs running Windows 10 22H2 as of this Tuesday. So I covered on the podcast previously that this was going to happen, and it's now happening. Microsoft has reminded Windows admins that driver synchronization in Windows Server Update Services, or WSUS, will be deprecated as of April 18th, so right around the corner. After its deprecation, Microsoft encourages enterprises to adopt cloud-based solutions for client and server updates, such as Windows Auto Patch, Azure Update Manager, and Microsoft Intune. It was a bad start to Monday for some Slack users. Slack confirmed an issue at the time that notifications were missing for some users. Even late into the morning, the behavior was not quite right, as notifications returned but did not appear until several minutes after a message had been received. By the time this episode is out, it's going to be later in the week, so it's a non-story, but it's always worth highlighting when such an important means of communication experiences such an issue. Finally, in the news for this week, security researcher Mehdi Elisa published technical details and a proof of concept exploit code for a critical vulnerability in Microsoft Configuration Manager, and it's tracked as CVE-2024-43468, and this had a severity score of 9.8. This flaw allows unauthenticated attackers to exploit SQL injection vulnerabilities, enabling the execution of arbitrary commands on servers and their underlying databases. One of the examples provided with the exploit would be that attackers can create a sysadmin account by injecting malicious SQL queries. And yes, I know SQL SQL, it is quite jarring to some people. I figured I'd call it out, even though I'm trying to save time on this episode. But successful exploitation allows attackers to access the Configuration Manager database, the cm-site-code database, and execute commands on the server. This could lead to full compromise of the deployment environment, data theft, and potential lateral movement within the network. Microsoft addressed this vulnerability back in October with the Windows updates for that month, and organizations using Microsoft Configuration Manager are urged to apply these patches immediately to prevent exploitation. Obviously, this exploit is out there now, so time is of the essence if you haven't already patched this. But now, this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. First up, and I'm going to try and do this quick to save some time, I saw that Thorsten shared a Get-PendingReboot PowerShell function that you may want to utilize in your scripts that will provide information on pending reboots on your systems, and that could be useful for all kinds of different workflows, perhaps such as your patching workflows, for example. And on the topic of PowerShell, actually, I've got a few PowerShell related ones here. The father of PowerShell, Jeffrey Snover, was asked whether where and for each should be treated as official keywords and used in production code. And he responded, "There is a time to be principled and a time to be pragmatic. On this one, we went with principled, a fully consistent model." And he said he assumed that the community would not shy away from aliases the way they have and would use them where they made sense. In retrospect, he says he should have hardwired those. It's always interesting to see, what the thought process was behind something like this when it was being developed. And Jeffrey is a great one for sharing these kinds of insights. So if you're not following him on Blue Sky, be sure to. It's jsnover.com on Blue Sky where you can find him. And again, PowerShell related, the Microsoft Entra PowerShell version 1 is now generally available. And this is a scenario-driven module that allows admins to efficiently manage Entra ID resources, including users, groups, applications, and policies, amongst others. And finally, Sam Curry did a really great write-up and video on how he hacked Subaru car software, tracking and controlling cars via their Starlink admin panel. And I decided to feature this as a tip rather than a story, as a fix was released 24 hours after this was disclosed, and it has not been leveraged for attacks. And really, I just thought it was really interesting to see the entire process, because Sam's blog post is really comprehensive, and it goes through various different scenarios of how he gained location information from his mother's Subaru, how he did certain actions remotely on a friend's Subaru, and more. It's just interesting to see his process and exactly what he achieved. So if you're interested like I was, I'll share a link to that with this episode, which you can find with this episode on 5bytespodcast.com under episode 371. So I tried to make some pivots while I was recording this episode to make it a little bit shorter. I went short on certain stories in the scripts, tricks, and tips, but I hope you enjoyed this show. This was a tough one to get out this week because a really bad storm hit Ireland, and I ended up being tight on time to try and get this episode recorded. But hey, thank you to my sponsors, because I don't think I would have persevered to get an episode out this week if I didn't have sponsors. And thank you all so much for listening too.